Mark, welcome to the show. Love to have you on again. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me, Michael.
You would have heard my introduction. That's right, isn't it? The rural sector in particular, over the last, it's been more than 100 years now, have continually bred or created new varieties to meet and to get ahead of our international competitors, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your assessment is right on the money. It's an area that we've always kind of excelled in as a country in terms of our, particularly, I guess, a pasture-based system, because we had a uniqueness in that regard. And so we undoubtedly led the world in sort of pasture-based cultivars, animal science, in terms of harnessing the advantages of having outdoor grazing systems. And so, years and years of great research kept us a leader in that field. It helped us really to maintain both our sort of innovation, I think. So we often led the way in innovation in new plants and varieties and stuff like that, but also it was instrumental in helping us to hold our kind of low-cost operating model, which was what gave us an international competitiveness when we were faced with competing against countries that had perhaps high levels of subsidies and such forth.
Right. Now, the decision of the government to end the ban of GM, in particular, genetically modified organisms, under conditions that are yet to be defined, I take it that Federated Farmers are fully in support of that?
Yeah, we are, but we recognise, I guess, that it's it's a little bit of a divisive subject. But it's interesting just looking back through the history, because I think one of the arguments here is that the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act was passed in 1996, and just looking back through some Federated Farmers history, a sort of policy position was established in 1998, really supporting the opening up of conversation and further closer look at the potential of gene technologies. And as you've kind of highlighted there in your intro, that all kind of got stifled about 20 odd years ago, and so last year, in the lead up to the general election, as you know, Federated Farmers put out a sort of policy document to help restore farmer confidence, 12 key policies that we wanted changed. And the key thing in understanding that was that we put those policies, not necessarily the greatest top 12 policies, but we put them into categories. And one of those categories was returning growth to rural economies. And underneath that, we had this policy area of supporting better use of technology. So it comes back to that first discussion that we just had there, that really we're at a stage, as a nation, that we're needing to see growth and productivity. We're at a stage where farm businesses, the biggest struggle they're facing at the moment is declining farm profitability. And so they need to be at a position where they've got that option to be able to use the latest technologies in order to make the most of really the opportunities that we have as a nation here. So from a Federated Farmers perspective, we endorsed that and we supported it through the election, and it's been great to see, the government kind of come to the point where they have today.
So it's common sense, basically, that this announcement's been made. Of course, we'll see the detail of what the constrictions are. There is how did it get to the point where we decided to turn our back on the technology anyhow? Mark, I don't quite understand that. I mean, I don't know where you were 20 years ago, but there was almost a fear. They talked about Frankenstein in food. Remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that. I think that the part of the problem here, and I think this is still going to be an issue going forward, is generally what we're doing is we're talking about gene technologies, and And gene technologies has changed quite considerably. And if you go back 20 years, I think all of the discussion was around what we would term GMO, genetically modified organisms. And whereas today what we're tending to talk more about is gene editing. And so there's a kind of a bit of a nuance there, and it's both a regulatory issue and it's a technical issue as well. So GMO is when you introduce a new or a foreign gene is inserted into the DNA strand, basically. Whereas gene editing, the gene is cut and the DNA is modified in some way, but tests can't distinguish whether an organism was created via sort of gene editing or whether it was done by conventional breeding.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit of a nuance that is a reflection of how far the technology has moved. Whereas 20 years ago, I guess the conversation seemed to be only about these genetically modified things, and that, I guess, created quite a lot of concern in people's mind. And it's still quite tricky because, that's still going to be prevalent, I guess, for a lot of people. And so understanding the nuance of the differences that we're talking about will possibly be quite critical in the conversation going forward.
Yes, the thing that strikes me as interesting about this, and this is where sort of science meets voodoo, is that the opposition to this would largely seem to be composed of a fear of something that hasn't happened. Yeah?
Yeah, I think so. In part, I guess there's also an element of trying to understand what the overseas experience has been and the way that this has been this technology has been used and utilised, and there are situations where people perhaps look at the large monocrops overseas and say, well, New Zealand's got quite a, very, very much a different environment. And so are we just trying to replicate something that perhaps functions well overseas but is not necessarily appropriate for New Zealand, And do we actually, therefore, as a smaller producer, more of a niche producer in some areas, have a bit of an advantage, a competitive market-led advantage by remaining GMO-free? So I think that's where the balance of that argument comes in.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that argument
options.
because it's the same nonsense argument about organics. Overseas consumers really don't give a toss, do they? Whether something's GM or GE free, given that most food that is now being consumed in the Western world has elements of both?
Yeah, well, in general, that would be correct because obviously what consumers tend to be most concerned about is price. So they're concerned about food security and they're concerned about food safety. So perhaps in the food safety component, the GMO part comes into the conversation. But those first two tend to be quite dominant. I guess though what you would say, and this is part of what we have to figure out as a country going forward, is how do we apply this? What does the new regulator look like? And how will they make decisions? I think it's really important that there's good transparency in the processes so that people understand what it is that we're doing and what advantages it's going to give us and what are some of the risks. Because, you could, overall, if you want to go back to that original argument of saying, well, we need to grow our economy, we need to drive profitable farm businesses, we need to be innovative and introduce new technology, not get left behind by the rest of the world. But simultaneously, I guess, we'd say we could support the principle that consumers have the right to be able to seek out non-GMO products if that's what they want to do.
Well, yeah, good luck.